We are going full Annabeth without the Riz ponytail today. It is boiling in here. Screw that, we are actually going full on Lester Papadopoulos with this face, complete with zits and acne, so enjoy. Alright, demigods, mortals, and monsters, I'll be real. Ever since I saw the synopsis for The Court of the Dead, the sequel to The Sun and the Star, I've been nervous and concerned that I wouldn't like where this story was going. I hope I'm wrong, but I think I've finally been able to put into words why I don't like this premise. So allow me to take you on a little journey through Percy Jackson to show how The Court of the Dead may stand out in good ways, but also bad ways. Kind of jarring ways. The book hasn't come out yet, so maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there'll be things to like about it that we can't anticipate right now. I don't want the story to go where I think it will. But until we know for sure, let's dive into the less than ideal plot for this book. And we'll even talk about Epic later as part of the conversation. Spoilers ahead for The Sun and the Star and Epic the Musical. To paraphrase from the Disney Books website, the synopsis of The Court of the Dead is as follows. Now that Bob showed monsters that they don't have to be evil and can choose their own paths, many start hanging out at Camp Jupiter. But something starts popping up to make them suffer for their paths, causing Will, Nico, and Hazel to team up in an attempt to stop it. Let's start with the positives. Hazel is in this book. Will and Nico are in this book, and they're all going to interact together as main characters. That's awesome. The book takes place at Camp Jupiter, meaning that we'll most likely see more of not only Frank, but also Tyson and Ella. Moving on to the negatives, the idea itself just doesn't work for me. They are seemingly going right past this previously bonkers idea of hordes of monsters being good into trying to defeat whoever is picking them off, and because this is Percy Jackson, that will most likely involve our heroes risking their lives countless times. They're really just saying, because Bob changed, and has proven it multiple times, even when directly confronted with that choice of who he wanted to be, has proven time and again that he is good now, to the point that he was captured by the deity of evil because he dared to change and she wanted him to go back to who he used to be. Because that guy changed, we're just going to trust that all the rest of these monsters have changed too. And I'm sorry, but I don't buy it. I do buy that the monsters are changing in the story, but I don't buy that it's a good premise. While we've had individual monsters like Bob, Tyson, and Ella being good before, suddenly shifting into whole groups of monsters is quite the leap to make. It's going to need to come with a really solid foundation in order to work, but I fear the foundation for The Court of the Dead might be more based on tropes than deep-rooted elements of this universe. I've noticed a trend in recent years, especially in queer media, where the monster isn't really the monster. In a more cliché way, it's sometimes stated as the monster is actually just misunderstood. The monster of the story has been vilified and viewed that way because of the society they live in, but they are not really evil. And many of these stories also subscribe to the idea that real monsters don't exist, just people who make mistakes and fear of the unknown that stokes the oppression of the supposed monster. Nimona is a good example of this, and it's also one of my favorite recent films. Other examples include the movie Sea Beast, the series Has Been Hotel, and even Epic the Musical. 2 out of 3 of those are also huge obsessions of mine. Take a wild guess. So as you can tell, I really like this type of story and its nuances. I think it can be done extremely successfully, and you can see how this mini-genre would appeal to queer people. Depending on the exact piece, there may be a more direct real-life parallel for the monster's socially stigmatized identity, like Nimona's gender fluidity, or just the vague idea that people aren't always the persona they take on to survive. Given how popular it is in queer media and in recent years, I feel pretty confident in saying that this is the direction The Court of the Dead is going in. Why am I not on board with it? Well, in case you haven't noticed, I like outsider stories, and that's why I like Percy Jackson. And it's also why I feel like monster redemption just doesn't work in that universe. What it neglects to acknowledge is the neurodivergent and other marginalized characters already present in this series, and what the monster's roles are in relation to those characters. Now, I want to make it clear that I'm not pretending to speak for the authors or know the Percy Jackson world better than Rick Riordan does, but I do feel like some pretty important things are being forgotten here. If I'm correct about my assumed direction for the novel, then it's obvious that, like me, the authors are attracted to this kind of story because they see an obvious queer metaphor in there. In people being seen as monsters and demonized by society despite just being people. Flawed. Victims of oppressive systems. Pulling this "they're not really evil" thing on characters like Mrs. Dodds or Matt Sloan may seem to make sense, but it neglects not only the pre-existing queer aspects of the series, but also the overall message it sends to all marginalized kids. The idea that we see in the monster isn't the monster stories typically explains that monsters are the oppressed ones. forced to conform to society's expectations, not having a choice but to fill the role of monster in order to survive. And that doesn't work here. The monster isn't a monster story, as we've defined it, relies on the idea that the monster, I promise I'm going to stop saying monster, is in some way oppressed by the supposed hero of that story. In this context, demigods. On the surface, you might think this has some merit. Demigods attack and kill monsters, sometimes in self-defense, sometimes actively seeking them out for glory. However, look a little deeper and you'll see who actually holds the power here. Annabeth says in the very first novel that the real world is where the monsters are. In the context, she says this because she's tired of being stuck at camp and wants to go on a quest to the real world to prove herself. But under the surface, Annabeth isn't all that afraid of mythological monsters. She's talking about the monsters of her past, the things that truly scare and affect her. At the end of the book, both Percy and Annabeth return to their mortal families, despite being safer at camp physically, and in Annabeth's case, emotionally. But she risks being disappointed by her father again because she can't live in safety all the time, and the real world is where the monsters are, where her real pain is. At the end of the day, though, Annabeth's line is just a more direct statement of what the subtext clearly shows. In Percy Jackson, the monsters and some of the gods represent real people who make the lives of kids like Percy more difficult. The adults who don't believe in him, who don't accommodate his needs as a neurodivergent child, who assume the worst in him, who assume that any trouble he gets in is his own fault and that there's just something wrong with him, rather than trying to see his side of things. These are the monsters of Percy Jackson. The oppressors, the gods who bully him, and the monsters who manipulate him. It's easy to overlook this because many monsters are shown to be mindless brutes who don't have much going on the cognitive level. But the books have a lot of themes about demigods not fitting in anywhere, not belonging to any one world. The entire point of the story is escapism for those kids. There's a reason why Percy Jackson lore includes the specific idea of monsters taking the form of school staff, like teachers or principals, or of other kids to hunt demigods down. They're bullies in many different forms. Take a look at the verse pentology through characters like Mrs. Dodds, Matt Sloan, Dr. Thorne, and Kelly. These are the monsters who take the forms of humans and bully Percy and his friends. They use their power to scare and ostracize demigods, whether it be authority they hold as adults over children, the size and number of Matt Sloan and his buddies, or Kelly's status as a well-liked popular girl at a school where Percy is a complete stranger. This kind of fades into the background in the later series where the monsters don't need to hide as much because the demigods know that they're demigods, but the idea still remains canon, even if it's only addressed in throwaway lines. From this angle, it's pretty easy to read Percy and the other demigods as the marginalized ones, as most readers have. This is most directly because Percy has ADHD and dyslexia, which is kind of what inspired the whole story. But so many kids can look at different aspects of themselves and insert themselves into Percy's struggles. Take it from a neurodivergent person who took a lot of joy and escapism from the Percy Jackson world when I was a kid. Thanks to characters like Mrs. Dodds and Matt Sloan being represented the way they were, as both literal and metaphorical monsters, I found a lot of healing and coped with a lot of crap. Like many, when I was in elementary school, I used to make believe that I was a demigod, and that my bullies were actually monsters. It's not until looking back on that situation as an adult that I realized just how much that meant for me. Just how much Percy Jackson helped me to get through it all. Thinking of myself as a demigod and the kids who bullied me as monsters like Matt Sloan gave me so much comfort. It's the type of simple make-believe that's pretty common in these types of stories, but beautiful and important all the same. There are magical elements to the struggle between demigods and monsters, like the monsters wanting to kill demigods and eat them for food, because it's fantasy, action, adventure at the end of the day. The real-life parallels may not be to a T, but they aren't lost on people either, including children. You need to separate the magical and mortal aspects of the story, connected though they may be. Riordan is telling you that the kids who bully you don't define your story, they're just an obstacle in it, but you can't take those elements at face value when they were never literal to begin with. In the same way that your dad, who left to get milk 15 years ago, isn't actually a Greek god, people don't spontaneously grow wings and fangs and attack children. You can take comfort in that idea, especially as a kid, but when you focus too strongly on the story as it literally is, the escapism stops being escapism, and the story stops making sense. Ultimately, from the start, Percy Jackson was about and for children with ADHD and dyslexia, whose heroism was directly connected to that, and with a protagonist from a financially disadvantaged home. When it comes to representing real-life identities, Riordan sometimes hits the nail on the head, sometimes half misses it, and sometimes misses it entirely. But the overall message that anyone can be a demigod, that anyone can be a hero, remains central to this universe. And this can and does easily extend to queer people. We've seen a similar message through a more familiar lens. I would argue that many aspects of the demigod struggle, never belonging anywhere and wanting to escape to a community built by people like you, can be read as a queer metaphor. Percy's feelings on being a demigod, of never belonging in any one world but trying to make peace with both parts of his nature, just screams bisexual struggle to me, and I would love to make a whole video essay on this someday, on why people read him as bisexual and how his experience feels so queer, but I just hope they don't try to make demigods look ignorant for casting aside monsters, or not exploring the points of view of those who are functionally oppressing them. Even if the authors try to make it look like a sign of growth or maturity for the demigods, well, it's not their responsibility to reason with their bullies, but more importantly, that just doesn't work and isn't appropriate for the situation at hand. Anger, like Percy's, is perfectly understandable and more realistic. I think I speak for a lot of us when I say that reading Percy Jackson for the first time, I felt so validated in the idea that I not only had a power I didn't realize, a power that could defeat my bullies, but a reason for their behavior. One that didn't excuse it, but lessened the feeling that there was something wrong with me that made me worthy of being bullied. Believing they were monsters tracking down a demigod was less about dehumanizing them and more about humanizing myself. What wouldn't have helped me? What wouldn't have helped so many with similar experiences? Being told to show sympathy for these people, when they would have only used that to bully me more. Yes, many bullies are human and can change. Even though I'm still affected by the experiences I had, I don't fault the other 11-year-old children who put me through it. However, there's a difference between the message, a bully can change, and the message, you should show sympathy to the people who are actively harming you. And when monsters have been presented as bullies to our marginalized heroes, the heroes that the audience will see themselves in, it's the latter message that may end up sticking. Demigods don't have to be, dare I say shouldn't be, perfect examples of constant kindness. That takes away their relatability. In The Lightning Thief, Percy is angry at everything and everyone that put him in his situation, but still stands up to his bullies and does the right thing. That story wouldn't be the beauty that it was, it wouldn't be the escape and healing that so many kids like me found in it, if one of the big morals had been to show sympathy to your oppressors. I'm not saying that's always a bad thing, but as a child being bullied by other children, let alone by adults, it is beyond frustrating to hear. We should be allowed to be flawed, to be angry, to be tired of these people who treat us like crap. Let us find that release through fiction, one of the few safe avenues for it, instead of being obsessed with a story with spotless morals. Because not only is that unattainable where the characters have to fight to survive, but it isn't worth it if it means alienating such a huge part of the audience that you would have hoped to hear it. Which brings us to one thing that is present and mildly annoying in The Sun and the Star is just how much more direct all the themes and ideas are. Will and Nico literally have a full-on conversation about it at the end of the book, and while it doesn't bother me that much, there are one-off moments that just make me cringe because they feel so unnecessary. Like they're spelling out good and nuanced scenes in the most obvious way possible, just in case any of us silly kitties came away with the wrong impression. For example, when Nico retrospects on the Cupid scene, Will says, consent. It makes people feel safe. Which, and I'm really not trying to be mean, sounds like a cartoon character talking to 7-year-olds. You don't need to say that. It was already clear. The Cupid scene in the House of Hades is not perfect and has justifiable criticisms, but it's still easy to understand as forced outing and wrong. It paints Cupid as an enforcer and highlights how horrible this experience is for Nico, how it risks permanently pushing him away from people. Nico mentions this in the following book, explaining that being bullied and forced to come out when he wasn't ready was far worse than the simple fact of talking about an embarrassing crush. An idea that The Sun and the Star once again spells out in perfect clarity when that's not truly necessary. It's not things being reiterated that bothers me. It's that it feels like it's being done because the authors think the original series wasn't clear enough or didn't address these things. Will's cringeworthy consent line is probably the result of them thinking, we have a platform. We have readers who will listen to us, and we are playing a role in shaping their minds.
Therefore, we should do everything we can to make it crystal clear what our stance is on things like consent. We should make it crystal clear how we feel about things like outing.
And no one here is denying that consent is important because no one here needs you to spell it out for us like first graders. I am now significantly older than the target age range of these books, and that might be influencing my opinion, but I don't think you need to be an adult to understand subtle messaging. In fact, isn't that subtle messaging and not talking down to the reader what drew a lot of kids to Percy Jackson? Isn't that same audience going to become frustrated if you repeatedly downplay their intelligence by making the message as obvious as possible? You need to know the public that you're addressing. Your audience, Riordan and Oshiro, is nowhere close to the kind of person who needs to hear this message the most directly. I'm not saying don't teach these things in your books, but don't become paranoid that your readers are going to get the wrong impression. Trust the nuances. Because if you don't tell a good story and tell it well, the audience isn't going to stick around long enough to be affected by lines like this. Bottom line, it's not about prioritizing the story over the morals. It's about telling a story that is great enough and powerful enough for people to be affected by its morals. People who are passionate about art understand the importance of fussing over little details. It's not just about loving your art enough to perfect it. It's knowing that if you want your art's core to resonate with the audience, you need to make it the best it can be in every way possible. Now look, contrarily to what I've been saying for the last 20 minutes, I don't hate The Sun and the Star. Overall, I actually like it quite a bit, but I see the cracks, and I'm afraid those cracks are going to get significantly bigger in The Court of the Dead. Not to go too deep in it, but I think we're looking at purity of consumption. I'm absolutely not an expert on this, but from what I understand, many younger people in fandom corners of the internet, most notably Tumblr, have noticed an issue with problematic media, and have come up with a useful but unnuanced solution. Purity of consumption, as it applies here, basically says that you should only consume art that has good morals. The idea appears in conversations around books, movies, TV shows, basically anything with a fandom. There are good things to take from this mentality. It correctly identifies a problem that the media has with glorifying some icky things in a way that makes them look more okay than they are. For example, unconsenting affection. It's a popular trope in action stories where a character who thinks they or their romantic interest is going to die kisses them dramatically before the big life and death moment, usually without their consent. And these moments are made to look big and romantic, but don't try it at home. Another example would be how the media often dismisses catcalling as flirting when it's really harassment. So I do understand the argument that we want our fictional heroes to communicate good real-life morals. And I agree that when bad things are presented harmlessly or glorified, it can harmfully impact how we see those things outside of fiction. The Percy Jackson world could use some small improvements in these areas. However, I don't think this means that stories should have to be paragons of what's right. Stories can serve a lot of purposes. They can be inspiring. They can also be cathartic, freeing, escaping, ways of exploring ideas without delivering a verdict on them. While the Percy Jackson series obviously has morals, not all good stories have to have morals, much less perfect morals. And it is at this point that I give myself any possible excuse to talk about Epic the Musical, because I do think it's relevant here. More specifically, I want to talk about how the lack of a specific message is one of Epic's biggest strengths, and the main reason why I love it so much. When I first heard about Epic, I thought, whatever. I had heard a few songs already and assumed it would be a normal, boring story about a dude starting off in an optimistic place, becoming self-serving and cynical once life got tough, and finally returning to being good and kind by the end. I figured I'd listen to the whole thing after its soundtrack kept showing up on my page, but I didn't expect to particularly enjoy it. Needless to say, I was pleasantly impressed. Epic, in the simplest of terms, is about Odysseus' journey from a man to a monster. One that essentially casts the protagonist as a slow burn villain. It treats Odysseus' transformation as not just necessary, but kind of the point. It's not something he can just come back from, nor is it something we're just supposed to ignore so the story can keep going. It's purposefully drawn attention to. The point is not to answer a question or craft a specific message. It's more to ask questions. The whole reason I like Epic, aside from the songs being absolute bangers, is because of the unconventional nature through which it casts its protagonist and his journey. The audience is led to embrace this transformation. As always, any audience member can have individual interpretations, but here's how the story is written, at least how I see it. Epic is a loose retelling of the Odyssey, showing the journey of Odysseus over the 10 years from the end of the Trojan War to his return home in Ithaca to be reunited with his wife and son. Odysseus starts the story as a noble warrior, respected by his comrades and soldiers, but also someone who wants to do the right thing and have a good heart. Which is pretty hard for him because in the second song, Zeus makes him kill a baby or never see his family again. But anyways, Odie's best friend Polites encourages him to be kind and greet the world with open arms. And for a while, he does, despite the growing doubts of his second-in-command Eurylochus and the rest of his crew. Over time, this costs him more and more, most notably in the song Ruthlessness, when Poseidon kills a bunch of his men, telling him that ruthlessness is mercy upon ourselves and the only way to survive in this cruel world. Halfway through the musical, in the song Monster, Odysseus finally reaches his breaking point. Witnessing all he's lost, he resolves to return home by any means necessary, including defeating the monsters they encounter by becoming the monster himself. He kind of snaps, declaring that if he needs to throw another infant to their death to get home, he'll do it in a second. Here we go, we're gonna sit in chairs the bisexual way. Going forwards, Odysseus unleashes a new level of mercilessness. When he willingly sacrifices 6 crew members to keep going, the remaining men turn on him. And then they die. Fun times! Odysseus does a lot of messed up stuff in the Thunder Saga, and the audience, instead of being mad at him or baited towards excuses for him, just accepts this. The way Epic is written and represents Odie's point of view, his horrible actions become simple facts, with no need for rationalization or even anger. Most stories that take this angle with their main character make excuses for said character because it's easier for the audience to root for them that way. Epic constantly brings up Penelope and Telemachus, but solely as motivations, not excuses. The musical genuinely isn't interested in making his actions look more okay than they are. Rather, it makes us root for him despite this, because we feel the pain and longing that he's feeling. Odysseus says so many times not just that he wants to get home, but that he's so close to Ithaca. When we kill him, that our journey's over. Our home's in sight, this storm's our final fight. I must become the monster and then we'll make it home. We're so close to home, this can't be where it ends. Home, I've reached it. My wife and son are past these shores. Because we're seeing his perspective and he feels horrible about betraying his brothers, we're disgusted with him just as he is disgusted with himself. We feel what he's feeling, and with the other men gone, he is the only one who can continue taking us through this voyage. There's no one else with him to root for or share their point of view, so his actions aren't right or wrong anymore, they're just sad, or uncomfortable, or desperate, or whatever they subjectively make you feel. And then, we reach the Vengeance Saga. Watching his last bit of mercy, his last bit of humanity, perish before he kicks ass in 600 Strike. From what we know about Odysseus and watching him get helplessly shoved around by ultra-powerful, ultra-petty gods earlier in the story, we are primed to see him as the little guy. I don't mean physically, although apparently he is shorter than most warriors. Anyway, because we see him as powerless for so long, because we see his humanity before he loses it, because we can relate to him, there is a catharsis in watching him stab the salt water right out of Poseidon, ignoring his pleas for mercy and asking him how it feels to be helpless, pulling that power switch we all wish we could pull on the bullies in our lives. However, we're still not done. Much like how both we and Odysseus feel horror and sorrow at his actions towards his crew, because we've experienced his love for them through his eyes and thus we've grown to care about them, so too do we feel quite the opposite at his actions in the Ithaca saga. Odysseus doesn't know the suitors, and neither do we really, so it follows that they're represented as world-class jerks with no redeeming qualities. Hold Them Down may not be pleasant to listen to when you actually hear the lyrics, but it does its job from the perspective of the larger story. Make us hate the suitors so much that we not only feel no sympathy for them when Odysseus turns the murder up to top speed, but actually find ourselves rooting for him. Rather than going in the stereotypical direction where Odysseus realizes he was wrong to be so heartless, wrong to turn himself into a monster to get home, where he needs to prove to his family and himself that he's still a good man in the end, and move closer to open arms as Polites once implored him, Epic embraces the idea that he's a horrible man now. In fact, he's not even a man. Odysseus has a song called, well, Odysseus, that is all about how he is a total monster now. We know this on a story level from the way he lashes out at the suitors, not just for what they plan to do to his family, but for all the ways he's been wronged by everyone on his journey, everyone who's filled his heart with hate. And we know on a musical level because much like with Polyphemus and Poseidon, Odysseus' name is chanted by the ensemble as he commits his horrible acts of violence, and the only characters who have a song named after them are the monsters, Polyphemus, Scylla, and Charybdis. Jorge Rivera Herons even throws in a reference to Scylla with the infamous line, "He's aiming for the torches," highlighting how Scylla sang about Odysseus being just like her, a monster. The suitors run from him, horrified, while he lurks in the shadows like a faceless force of evil, making him look almost antagonistic. Bisexual chair. A second time. Alright. Not actually bisexual, which is weird, but now I've only really scratched the surface of why Epic hits the way it does. If you want a whole video talking about Epic, let me know, because I will gladly oblige. But the point of this totally relevant detour was to show that art and storytelling shouldn't be limited to spotless morals, or even morals at all. Epic is beautiful because rather than the characters coming to an objectively correct middle ground between ruthlessness and open arms, there's just differing perspectives, asking questions about mercy and closed-heartedness rather than answering them, and experiencing catharsis through Odie's actions. There is no message, and it may not have invented these concepts, but it's a great example of them. Percy Jackson, unlike Epic, obviously has messages, and demigods are overall the good guys. But the heroes don't need to always do the right thing. They can be kids just trying to survive and make sure the world doesn't incidentally end. Riordan understood that a lot of middle schoolers, heck, a lot of adults, enjoy hero-style stories about beating up monsters. There doesn't need to be a perfect justification for doing it. It's allowed to be messy. That messiness may not be comfortable, but the Percy Jackson world doesn't need to have clear-cut morals when the real world doesn't have those either. While you could argue that the idea that being a hero involves hurting what's different is a troubling trend,
kids, little kids, they grow up believing that they can be a hero if they drive a sword into the heart of anything different. And I'm the monster?
like I said, demigods align far more closely with marginalized people than monsters do in this metaphor. Trying to suddenly flip the switch and cast monsters in a totally different light, it's not that the story you're trying to tell is bad, but you're kind of ignoring the books that already exist. I am enthusiastically supportive of telling this queer story with a queer author, but as I said in my other video, things should feel consistent. The clash between this direction for the Court of the Dead and the original interpretation of the monsters as oppressors just hurts. There are good things about vanilla stories, but trying to create a morally clean story out of a messy one only serves to remove the nuances that made the original's impact. It's not just that the story won't be good, it's that people won't enjoy it enough for the morals to stick, thus causing more harm. All that being said, that's just my opinion. And I want to reiterate that it's only a potential direction of where I think the story is going, not a definitive statement. I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. When it comes out, I'm going to do my best to approach the Court of the Dead with an open mind, and I hope I'm not going to be sitting here a month from now saying, I knew it. But we'll just have to see. Until then, you can share your opinions on the upcoming book and what you think the effects will be on the wider Percyverse in the comments. Where do you think the Camp Half-Blood universe should go from here? This has been the DemigodLover, and I'll see you all next time. This has been the DemigodLover, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.